In this video we're going to look at finding the percent when we know the part and the whole in certain story problems. And there's a couple different ways to do this. In this video we are going to solve these using proportions. So this is the technique we're going to use. The part divided by the whole equals the percent over 100. So let's take a look at an example. Jim got 15 questions out of 20 correct on his test. What percent of the questions did he get right? So as I said, in this video we're always going to be looking for the percent. Alright, so we know the part that he got right is 15 out of 20. So the part in this case is 15, that's how many he got right, out of the whole, which is the entire number of questions on the test, that's 20. And we want to know what percent did he get right. In this particular case, some of you may be able to look at this and tell what the answer is because the numbers are kind of nice, and we're going to get to some examples where we won't be able to do that. But let's go ahead and compute this with this formula first, and then we'll talk about checking our answer. So the percent is what we don't know. We don't know the percent up there. So I'm going to leave that blank. Maybe put a question mark or an X if you're comfortable with sort of an algebra, a letter representing an unknown quantity, and the hundred's going to be on the bottom. I think I'll just leave that blank for this particular example. So this is what we're trying to figure out. We'll put a question mark. I decided. Okay. So we want to figure out 15 over 20 is equivalent to what over 100? Well, there's a couple different ways to do this. In this particular case, since 20 goes into 100, we could figure out a number that we could multiply by 20 to get 100. 20 times what would be 100? That would be 5. So I can do the same thing in the numerator and take 15 times 5 to determine what value my question mark needs to be up there. So 15 times 5 should be 75. Carry the 2, 7. So therefore, this question mark right here should be 75, which gives me my percent. So my answer is 75%. That's how many he got right. It's not always going to be the case that we can take what's in the denominator and multiply it by something and come up with 100. That's obviously not going to work every time. But if you can do that, this is kind of a shortcut way to find the answer. So another way to find the answer, I'm going to do the same exact problem. 15 over 20 equals what? We'll do x this time, over 100. We're trying to figure this out. Another way to do the problem is something we call cross multiplication. Now, cross multiplication only works when you have a fraction equal to a fraction, which is what a proportion is. All right, we're using proportions. That means a fraction is equal to a fraction. You can't use this when you're multiplying fractions or subtracting fractions or dividing fractions or anything else. So be very, very careful when you're doing this that you're doing it in the proper context. So when we do cross multiplication, what we're literally going to do is we're going to multiply the numbers that are across from each other. So I'm going to take the 15 times 100, and I'm going to write that right below the 100 here. So that's going to be 1500. And then I'm going to take the 20 times the x and write that underneath the 20, and I'm going to get 20x. And that's going to equal 1500. So in other words, I have 20. Let me put, some of you may not be used to this part, so let's put, this is 20 times x. 20 times x. So those parentheses mean multiplication. I guess you could write it out with a... You don't want to do xx because then that looks funny. Sometimes dot is used for times. So we could say 20 times x like that if you're not comfortable with the 20 next to the x. So we have 20 times some number is equal to 1500. In order to figure that out, we have to take 1500 and divide it by the 20. If you think about it, let's look at an easier example. Let's say you had 2 times something equals 8. Well, you know what that is. That's 4. Well, another way you could figure that out would be to take 8 divided by 2, and that would tell you what your missing number is. So in this case, we would take 1500 divided by 20. That's what we need to do. 1500 divided by 20. So how many times does 20 go into 1500? Well, we could, we'll do the long division. So 20 into 1500. Let's see, 20 goes into 157 times for 140. Subtract that and we get 10. Bring down the 0. 20 goes into 100 5 times exactly. So our answer is 75, which is the same thing we got when we did it the other way over here. So the answer is 75%. Now this is a very algebraic way to look at this. How I did here with the x and cross multiplying and dividing. If you're not very comfortable with algebra, let me show you another way to do this. Cross multiplying. That's going to give you the same answer. If you look at what's across from each other, you've got two numbers that are across from each other and then one number across from what you don't know. Let's go ahead and put that question mark back in there. So a shortcut to do cross multiplication is to multiply the two numbers that are across from each other. 15 times 100. And then whatever you get for that answer, you're going to divide it by 20. That will always work. Take the two numbers that are across from each other and divide it by the number that's across from what you want to figure out, which is exactly what we did over here. We took 15 times 100, which gave us 1500, and then we divided that by 20, which we did up here, and that gave us 75. So that's kind of a way to do it without writing the x and everything like that, if you like that better. So the answer here is 75%. We've looked at a couple different ways to do this, and sometimes that can be helpful and sometimes that can be confusing, like too much information. So let's look at another example. Let's see, let's try this one. A survey found that 5 out of 8 people watched the Super Bowl. What percent of people watched the Super Bowl? See if you can set this part up right here. What's the part, what's the whole, equals what you don't know over 100. Can you set that up? Give it a try. So hopefully you got 5 is the part of the people that watch the Super Bowl out of 8. So 5 out of every 8 people watch the Super Bowl. And we want to know what percent is that out of 100. Because that's what percent means. Percent means per 100. So if 5 out of 8 people watched it, how many out of 100 people watched it? That's what we're trying to figure out. And that will tell us the percent. Now in this case, you can see that there's nothing I can multiply 8 by, no nice number, that gives me 100. So I can't use that little technique that we used, very first problem that we did, the very first technique we used. We can't use this technique here. So we're going to go ahead and use the cross multiplication technique. The quick way I showed you at the end was to multiply the two numbers across from each other, 5 times 100, and then divide that by the answer, the number that's across from what you want to know, which is the 8. So 5 times 100 is 500 divided by 8. That's what we need to figure out. Let's go ahead and pull up the calculator for this one. Something interesting is going to happen here. So we do 500 divided by 8 equals, and we get 62.5. So that means our answer is 62.5%. And you're going to get a decimal here a lot of times when you can't multiply 8 by anything to get 100. You're going to come up with a decimal, and that's fine. You can have a decimal in your percent. So all we're saying is 62.5% of the people watch the Super Bowl, which is approximately 62.5 people out of 100. Now, you obviously can't have 0.5 people, but percents are used to talk about how many out of 100 if you had 100 people. So if it went to 200, this would be double, and then we wouldn't have that decimal anymore. If we look at this and do it sort of the algebraic way, let's go ahead and write that down anyway and show that it does come up with the same answer. If we put an x here, we would multiply the 5 times 100. So we're going to cross multiply here. 5 times 100. And we get 500, just like we did when we did it this other way over here. And then we're going to take 8 times x. So we get 8 times x equals. And then to find out what x is, we just divide by 8. 500 divided by 8. And that's exactly what we did over here. And that came up with 62.5. Now I'm showing both ways because some of you are going to want to see an algebraic way to do this as you move on, and you're going to have to take algebra, so you might as well see it this way. Some of you may not be looking for an algebraic way to do it. You don't want to deal with x's and equal signs, and so you can do that this way over here on the right. Now just another little thing you might want to know is when you do 8 times x, you really don't have to write these parentheses here. If I put an 8 and an x right next to each other, that means 8 times x. Okay, let's have you guys try another one. And on this one, I would say that, well, let's do this one first where you don't have to use a calculator. Well, you might want to use a calculator. The last one, you absolutely want to use a calculator. At a pizza place one Friday night, 18 out of 72 pizzas ordered, I should say pizzas, I should check my typing, pizzas ordered were pepperoni. What percent of the pizzas ordered were pepperoni? So we want to figure out the percent. Go ahead and pause the video and try this one on your own. Okay, so to set this up, we're going to say 18 out of 72 is how much out of 100. That's what we're trying to figure out. So we've got two numbers across from each other and one number across from the number we're trying to figure out. We're going to multiply the two numbers across from each other. So 18, I'm going to use the parentheses, 18 times 100. That gives me 1800. And then we're going to divide that by the number that's across from the value we want to find, which is 72. 1800 divided by 72 is 25. So that means 25% of the pizzas ordered were pepperoni. Now, does that make sense? I haven't talked about this in the previous examples, but you should always go back and see if your answer makes sense. So 25% would be exactly 1/4. And we've got 18 out of 72 pizzas ordered that were pepperoni. So what we're saying is 1/4 was 18. So that should mean that 18 times 4 is 72. And it is. So that would mean 25% is definitely a reasonable answer. And it is actually the correct answer. All right, let's try one more. This one you'll want to use a calculator as well. Sam paid $15.12 in tax on a $240 purchase. What is the tax rate? Go ahead and give that one a try. Alright, so the part he paid in tax was $15.12 out of a total $240 purchase. And the tax rate is going to be some percent. So some percent out of 100. And this would tell you how many dollars you would have to pay out of 100. So we're going to multiply the numbers across from each other. $15.12 times 100, which gives you 1512. Remember, when you're multiplying by 100, you just move the decimal 2 places. You could do that on your calculator if you want. And then we're going to divide that by the number across from what we don't know, which is 240. So I'll pull up my calculator for that. $15.12 divided by 240. And that's your percent, 6.3. So we have 6.3, and that's my answer, so that is 6.3%. So what we're saying here is 15.12 over 240 is the same as 6.3 over 100. So this is your percent right there, since it's out of 100. Well, that's one way to solve problems where you're trying to find the percent is given using a proportion. In another video, we're going to look at using a formula to find the value of the percent. You need to do it whatever way works best for you, whichever way that you can remember. That's the best way for you to do the problem.